So last week we got through the first couple of pages of a study in Scarlet, and we're introduced to the two main characters, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, who have become flatmates. Now, Watson has kind of figured out what Sherlock's job is, basically by coming out and asking directly. And Watson is still a little unsure that Sherlock Holmes has this ability to make major conclusions from little tiny bits of evidence. Sherlock does describe to him how he knew that Watson was a military man, a doctor, and had just returned from Afghanistan. And Watson understands his logical conclusion, but still wants to test Holmes further. He's still thinking it might be a trick. Now, Doyle talks about logic and deduction by way of examples set into the story. When we read Poe's A Murder in the Rue Morgue, Poe actually writes an introduction before he gets to the story, sort of like reading a manual. Pretty dry, pretty boring, about logic and deductive reasoning. So Doyle's use by placing it in the story makes it a lot more palatable, and you can see some actual use of what becomes later known as the Holmesian paradigm. So Watson finally has an opportunity to test Sherlock again, and he looks out the window. Watson looks out the window, and he sees this older fellow kind of meandering down the street, and he points him out to Sherlock and says, hey, what do you think of that man right there? What can you deduce by your form of logic about him? And on the next slide, we're going to get into detail about that interchange. I wonder what that fellow was looking for, I asked, pointing to a stalwart, plainly dressed individual who was walking slowly down the other side of the street, looking anxiously at the numbers. He had a large blue envelope in his hand and was evidently the bearer of a message. You mean the retired sergeant of Marines? Said Sherlock Holmes. Brag and bounce, I thought to myself. He knows that I cannot verify his guess. The thought had hardly passed through my mind when the man whom we were watching caught sight of the number on our door and ran rapidly across the roadway. We heard a loud knock, a deep voice below, and heavy steps ascending the stairs. For Mr. Sherlock Holmes, he said, stepping into the room, handing my friend the letter. Here was an opportunity of taking the conceit out of him. He little thought of this when he made that random shot. May I ask, my lad, I said in the blandest voice, what your trade may be? Commissioner, sir, he said gruffly. Uniform away for repairs. And you were, I asked with a slightly malicious glance at my companion. A sergeant, sir. Royal Marine Light Infantry, sir. No answer. Right, sir. He clicked his heels together, raised his hand in a salute, and was gone. I confess that I was considerably startled by this fresh proof of the practical nature of my companion's theories. My respect for his powers of analysis increased wondrously. There was still remained some lurking suspicion in my mind, however, that the whole thing was prearranged, intended to dazzle me, though what earthly object he could have in taking me in was past my comprehension. When I looked at him, he had finished reading the note, and his eyes had assumed that vacant, lackluster expression which showed mental abstraction. How in the world did you deduce that? I asked. Deduced what? He said petulantly. Why, that he was a retired sergeant of Marines. I have no time for trifles, he answered brusquely, and then with a smile, excuse my rudeness. You broke my thread of thoughts, but perhaps it is as well. So you actually were not able to see that the man was a sergeant of Marines? No, indeed, I said. It was easier to know than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. Even across the street, I could see a great blue anchor tattooed on the back of the fellow's hand. That smacked of the sea. He had a military carriage, however, and regulation side whiskers. There we have the Marine. He was a man with some amount of self-importance and a certain air of command. You must have observed the way that he held his head and swung his cane. A steady, respectable, middle-aged man, too, on the face of him. All facts which led me to believe that he had been a sergeant. Wonderful, I said. Commonplace, said Holmes, though I thought from his expression that he was pleased at my evident surprise and admiration.